settle by the sea. I know your hand is always there to guide me. You are there, you are there, you are there, you are there. Where can I go? Where can I go from your presence? Trouble is in my way, you're already there. You will not go, from my presence. For a word of mine is said, if in the depths I lay my head, in the shadow of your wings you're there to hide me. You are there, 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 you are there. I've got my faith in the Lord, and it's working in me. I've got my faith in the Lord, and it's showing in me. I've got my faith in the Lord, and it's plain to see. I've got my faith in the Lord. I'm so glad I've got my faith in the Lord. I've got the love of the Lord. I've got the love of the Lord, and it's working in me. I've got the love of the Lord, and it's showing in me. I've got the love of the Lord, and it's plain to see. I've got the love of the Lord. I'm so glad I've got the love of the Lord. I've got the joy of the Lord. I've got the joy of the Lord, and it's working in me. I've got the joy of the Lord, and it's showing in me. I've got the joy of the Lord, and it's plain to see. I've got the joy of the Lord. I'm so glad I've got the joy of the Lord. I've got the joy of the Lord. I've got the joy of the Lord, and it's working in me. I've got the joy of the Lord, and it's showing in me. I've got the joy of the Lord, and it's plain to see. I've got the joy of the Lord. I'm so glad I've got the joy of the Lord. I've got my faith in the Lord. I've got my faith in the Lord, and it's working in me. I've got my faith in the Lord, and it's showing in me. I've got my faith in the Lord, and it's plain to see. I've got my faith in the Lord. I'm so glad I've got my faith in the Lord. I've got the love of the Lord. I've got the love of the Lord, and it's working in me. I've got the love of the Lord, and it's showing in me. I've got the love of the Lord, and it's plain to see. I've got the love of the Lord. I'm so glad I've got the love of the Lord. I've got the joy of the Lord. I've got the joy of the Lord, and it's working in me. I've got the joy of the Lord, and it's showing in me. I've got the joy of the Lord, and it's plain to see. I've got the joy of the Lord. I'm so glad I've got the joy of the Lord. 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 I've got the joy of the joy. I've got the joy of the joy of the Lord. I've got the joy of the Lord.
The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I will hope in him. The steadfast love
Welcome to our Bible study. My name is Clint McElroy. Today we'll be in 2 Samuel chapter 18. The material today will contain adult themes, so please be advised before showing this to children. We are meeting today at 10 a.m., so please join us if you can. Hope to see you there. Masks will be available at the door for anyone who needs one. If you're sick in any way, please don't come to the auditorium, but instead stay home and enjoy the streaming service. We'll also meet for classes at 9 a.m., so please join us for those as well. You're welcome to join us in the auditorium to watch this class on the large screen there. We want to make sure everyone knows we have these English Standard Version Bibles from the World Bible School available. If you care to have one, please contact our church office and we'll make arrangements to get you one. Our sick list is quite long, so please refer to the bulletin for more information. We do want to keep in our prayers the family of Emma Richardson, who passed away on May 17th. The graveside and family visitation will be on May 23rd at 11 a.m. at Nelson Grove Cemetery in Whitesboro, Texas. We want to keep in our prayers Jackson Jones, the son of Brian Jones and grandson of Corey and Julie Jones, who is recovering from a head injury. We also want to keep in our prayers Elaine Eisenberger, Rosie Coyle's sister, who has been diagnosed with breast cancer and is having surgery on May 23rd. I want to remember Brandy Krim, who is having surgery at Baylor Dallas on May 24th at 8 a.m. We want to remember Aline Kelly, who is recovering from some complications of a surgery she had. We want to remember Sherry Cracha, Betty Hart, Joy McElroy, Charles and Karen Brazil, Kent Gauntly, Jeanette and Ron Inman, Don Jones, Marianne Kinsey, Donnie Glenn Dixon, and my friend David Garza. As is our custom, we want to remember the story of the two men on the road to Emmaus who were joined by a third man on the way. When they got to Emmaus, that third man revealed himself to be Jesus. Then he left their company. The two men realized that while he'd been with them on the journey, there had been a burning in their hearts. It's that burning that they had in their hearts that we hope to kindle in our own hearts as we draw closer to the Lord through a study of His Word. We also want to remember the admonitions of Leviticus chapter 19, to be holy, for the Lord our God is holy. And we should remember the admonitions of the stories of Rehoboam, Jeroboam, and the prophet that came to Jeroboam. There was a judgment upon Solomon, and the kingdom was split. And it was split because Rehoboam, the new king, decided to follow the advice of young, inexperienced advisors rather than the advice of older men. It resulted in the division of the kingdom. Jeroboam had been told by God while Solomon was still king that he would take over part of the kingdom when Solomon passed, and that if he did well, he would be blessed as David had been blessed. He lived out the rest of Solomon's life in exile in Egypt, and when Solomon passed, he came back and took over the northern tribes that had split away from Rehoboam. Now, upon taking over, he did not do what the Lord had advised. Instead, he built high places in the mountains and created false gods and put them there and told the people that these were the gods that led them out of Egypt. And he set up a false priesthood and told the people that they should worship God and make sacrifice in the mountains. And this false priesthood supported that activity. This was an abomination before the Lord. It did not end with Jeroboam. It remained a problem for all the kings after Jeroboam in Israel. These high places remained in Israel until the time of Jesus. Now, God just didn't let Jeroboam do that. He sent a prophet to tell him not to do it. Jeroboam ultimately ignored the prophet. The prophet decided to go home according to the instruction of the Lord, but he was met in the way by another prophet from Israel. This prophet wanted to have the honor of his company because he was a prophet of the Lord, and invited him to come home and said that the Lord had told him to do so. This was a lie. It was not true. And when the first prophet believed that story and came and ate with the second prophet did in fact prophesy and told the first prophet that he had believed a lie and that his life was forfeit because of it. It's a terrible story about the consequences of believing a lie. It was, I think, meant to make it clear that the children of Israel had done a terrible thing in believing Jeroboam's lie. It's a terrible thing to believe a lie, especially when we know the truth or had known the truth before we accepted the lie. That's why we study. We go to God's Word to know what that truth is, to know when someone's telling us something other than what's in the Scripture. We'll know that that's a lie. I recently saw the title to a YouTube video that said, How We Get Around the Bible. an explanation of how they could justify certain activities in worship that were not acceptable to God. This is not what we should do at all. We should be looking to the Scripture to find out what is acceptable to God and follow after the instruction of the Lord. I hope you'll join me now as we enter into this study of 2 Samuel chapter 18, that you'll find a word of encouragement there. 2 Samuel chapter 18 from the English Standard Version. Then David mustered the men who were with him, and set over them commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds. And David sent out the army, 1/3 under the command of Joab, 1/3 under the command of Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother, and 1/3 under the command of Ittai the Gittite. And the king said to the men, I myself will also go out with you. But the men said, You shall not go out, for if we flee, they will not care about us. If half of us die, they will not care about us. But you are worth 10,000 of us. Therefore it is better that you send us help from the city. The king said to them, Whatever seems best to you I will do. So the king stood at the side of the gate, while all the army marched out by hundreds and by thousands. Verse 5. And the king ordered Joab and Abishai and Ittai, Deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. And all the people heard when the king gave orders to all the commanders about Absalom. Verse 6. So the army went out into the field against Israel, and the battle was fought in the forest of Ephraim. And the men of Israel were defeated there by the servants of David. And the loss there was great on that day, 20,000 men. Verse 8. The battle spread over the face of all the country, and the forest devoured more people that day than the sword. Verse 9. And Absalom happened to meet the servants of David. Absalom was riding on his mule, and the mule went under the thick branches of a great oak, and his head caught fast in the oak, and he was suspended between heaven and earth, while the mule that was under him went on. And a certain man saw it and told Joab, Behold, I saw Absalom hanging in an oak. Joab said to the man who told him, What? You saw him? Why then did you not strike him there to the ground? I would have been glad to give you 10 pieces of silver and a belt. But the man said to Joab, Even if I felt in my hand the weight of 1,000 pieces of silver, I would not reach out my hand against the king's son. For in our hearing the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai, For my sake protect the young man Absalom. On the other hand, if I had dealt treacherously against his life, and there is nothing hidden from the king, then you yourself would have stood aloof. Joab said, I will not waste time like this with you. And he took 3 javelins in his hand and thrust them into the heart of Absalom while he was still alive in the oak. And 10 young men, Joab's armor-bearers, surrounded Absalom and struck him and killed him. Verse 16. Then Joab blew the trumpet, and the troops came back from pursuing Israel, for Joab restrained them. And they took Absalom and threw him into a great pit in the forest, and raised over him a very great heap of stones. And all Israel fled, every one to his own home. Now Absalom in his lifetime had taken and set up for himself the pillar that is in the king's valley, for he said, I have no son to keep my name in remembrance. He called the pillar after his own name, and it is called Absalom's monument to this day. Verse 19. Then Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said, Let me run and carry news to the king that the Lord has delivered him from the hand of his enemies. And Joab said to him, You are not to carry news today. You may carry news another day, but today you shall carry no news, because the king's son is dead. Then Joab said to the Cushite, Go tell the king what you have seen. The Cushite bowed before Joab and ran. Then Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said again to Joab, Come what may, let me also run after the Cushite. And Joab said, Why will you run, my son, seeing that you will have no reward for the news? Come what may, he said, I will run. So he said to him, Run. Then Ahimaaz ran by the way of the plain and outran the Cushite. Verse 24. Now David was sitting between the 2 gates, and the watchman went up to the roof of the gate by the wall. And when he lifted up his eyes and looked, he saw a man running alone. The watchman called out and told the king. And the king said, If he is alone, there is news in his mouth. And he drew nearer and nearer. The watchman saw another man running, and the watchman called to the gate and said, See, another man running alone. The king said, He also brings news. The watchman said, I think the running of the first is like the running of Ahimaaz the son of Zadok. And the king said, "He is a good man and comes with good news." Verse 28. Then Ahimaaz cried out to the king, "All is well." And he bowed before the king with his face to the earth and said, "Blessed be the Lord your God, who has delivered up the men who raised their hand against my lord the king." And the king said, "Is it well with the young man Absalom?" Ahimaaz answered, "When Joab sent the king's servant, your servant, I saw a great commotion, but I do not know what it was." And the king said, "Turn aside and stand here." So he turned aside and stood still. Verse 31. And behold, the Cushite came, and the Cushite said, "Good news from my lord the king, for the Lord has delivered you this day from the hand of all who rose up against you." The king said to the Cushite, "Is it well with the young man Absalom?" And the Cushite answered, "May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up against you for evil be like the young man." And the king was deeply moved, and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, he said, "O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son." Okay, so last week we read out of chapter 17 how the end started for Absalom. We saw at the very beginning of chapter 17 Ahithophel's plan for Absalom. He said, "Let me choose 12,000 men, and I will rise and pursue David tonight. I will come upon him while he is weary and discouraged, and throw him into a panic, and all the people who are with him will flee. I will strike down only the king, and I will bring all the people back to you as a bride comes home to her husband. You seek the life of only one man, and all the people will be at peace." And the advice seemed right in the eyes of Absalom and all the elders of Israel. Ahithophel's plan was to rush the tired and discouraged king, and in the panic that would ensue, he anticipated that all those men there who were supporting the king would flee, leaving the king alone, and then he would be able to kill only the king. This seemed right and appropriate to Absalom and the elders of Israel, but they called Hushai the Archite and said they wanted to hear his ideas. And Hushai said that this time the counsel that Ahithophel has given is not good. So he advised that the king's advisor had not given him appropriate advice. Then he made up this story. He said, "You know that your father and his men are mighty men, and that they are enraged, like a bear robbed of her cubs in the field. Besides, your father is expert in war, and he will not spend the night with the people. But behold, he's even now hidden himself in one of the pits in some other place. And as soon as there is an attack, basically, anybody who dies, it will be you who take the responsibility of the death. You will be considered the one who lost out." I'm paraphrasing greatly here what has been said in the scripture. "Then the people will fear the king and his men, because they know that he is a mighty man. Those who are with him are valiant men. But my counsel is that all Israel be gathered to you from Dan to Beersheba as the sand by the sea for multitude, and that you go to battle in person. So then when we come upon him in some place where he is to be found, and light upon him as the dew falls on the ground, and of him and all the men who are with him not one will be left." So his plan was to attack them all and kill them all. "And if they flee into some city, we'll go with ropes and drag their wall into the valley, that not even one pebble be found there." So he was advising that they go after with all earnestness every one of David's supporters as well as David. And Absalom and all the men of Israel said, "The counsel of Hushai the Archite is better than the counsel of Ahithophel. For the Lord had ordained to defeat the good counsel of Ahithophel, so that the Lord might bring harm to Absalom." So we see here at this very last verse, in verse 14, that Ahithophel's plan was the better plan by even the Lord's determination, and that this advice from Hushai was a bad plan, a plan that would not serve Absalom well. "Then Hushai said to Zadok and Abiathar the priests, Thus and so did Ahithophel counsel Absalom, and thus and so did I counsel. Now therefore send quickly and tell David." This was all part of David's plan of leaving Zadok and Abiathar the priests, as well as the Ark of the Covenant, in Jerusalem, even though he was going to abandon it himself. And so they sent out to Jonathan and Ahimaaz, who were waiting at Enrogel. A female servant went out to tell them. They were trying to hide this activity, But someone saw this happen and reported it back to Absalom. And Absalom sent men to pursue Jonathan and Ahimaaz. They caught up with Jonathan and Ahimaaz at Bahurim, the house of a man who had a well in his courtyard. And they jumped in the well, and a woman there took and spread over a covering and scattered grain on it, in verse 19. And when the servants of Absalom came seeking these two men, the woman said, "They have gone over the brook of water." So these men went and tried to find them, but they couldn't find them, and went back to Jerusalem. After these men had gone, Jonathan and Ahimaaz come up out of the well and went and told David what they'd found out. When Ahithophel, in verse 23, sees that his counsel was not followed, he saddled his donkey and went off to his hometown. There he settled his own house and put it in order and hanged himself, and died and was buried in the tomb of his father. So Ahithophel, even when he was denied the opportunity to serve Absalom with this good advice, still understood that his plan was good. His plan was the one that would have worked for Absalom. And when he saw that Absalom had not taken that advice, and that his advice was considered less valuable than Hushai, and potentially he understood that Hushai was misleading Absalom, he saw that the end was written and that it was not going to come up good for him. So he went and hung himself. And it's hard to accept this because of the kind of a man that Ahithophel was apparently before he betrayed David, was one who spoke after the oracles of God. When he spoke, people considered it to be exactly God's word. So it was a terrible thing to see this happen. It's terrible in my opinion, to see Ahithophel's end. A man who had apparently spoken the counsel of God. Even in this situation, he gave the advice that would have served Absalom to the best ends that Absalom could have sought. The advice we saw him give about the concubines was off, and it was more of a prophecy, in my opinion, of what was going to happen because of the judgment that God had directed against David. And again, when God directs a judgment, he is not saying that the thing that will happen in judgment is good. He is simply allowing evil consequences to follow an evil act. These things that happen in the lives of men, sin that happens because men are tempted of their own desires and yield to that temptation. And so in verse 24, David came to Mahanaim, and Absalom crossed the Jordan with all the men of Israel. And Absalom had set Amasa over the army instead of Joab. So we find out in chapter 18 that Joab is in fact with David. Amasa was the son of a man named Ithra the Ishmaelite, who had married Abigail, the daughter of Nahash, sister of Zeruiah, Joab's mother. So he was related by marriage to Joab. And Zeruiah is the mother of Joab and Abishai. And that is news to me. Somehow I'd missed that or forgotten it. And Israel and Absalom encamped in the land of Gilead. David came to Mahanaim, Shobi the son of Nahash from Rabbah of the Ammonites, and Machir the son of Amiel from Lodabar, and Barzillai the Gideonite from Rogelim, brought beds, basins, earthen vessels, wheat, barley, flour, parched grain, beans, lentils, honey, curds, sheep, cheese, and cheese from the herd, for David and the people with him to eat. For they said, the people are hungry and weary and thirsty in the wilderness. And that brings us to chapter 18. The events of chapter 18 are very sad in my view. It hurts to read it. But going into it, we see that David musters his men who were with him and set over them commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds. So he organizes his men. David sent out the army, 1/3 under the command of Joab, 1/3 under the command of Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother, and 1/3 under the command of Ittai the Gittite. And the king said to the men, I myself will go out with you. But the men said, you shall not go out, for if we flee, they will not care about us. If half of us die, they will not care about us, but you are worth 10,000 of us. So there would have been extreme limitations on their ability to protect David in the field, because they realized that they were not the ones being pursued, again following the concepts as established by Ahithophel's plan. Ahithophel sought to kill only David. So these men were apparently of the same opinion and realized that if they were out in the field with David and needed to move and David was not with them, then they would not be pursued. They'd have no ability to draw the enemy to them. They would lose the king almost immediately in any kind of tactical situation. So they didn't want the king to follow them. They wanted him in a safe place where he could direct resources to their needs as he saw fit from that safe place, and they would be able to engage the enemy better. The king said to them in verse 4, "Whatever seems best to you I will do." So the king stood at the side of the gate while all the army marched out by hundreds and by thousands. And the king ordered Joab and Abishai and Ittai, "Deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom." And all the people heard when the king gave orders to all the commanders about Absalom. So that's not really great. Having said this before all the people now were going to be much more timid when it came to Absalom than perhaps they should have been otherwise. And indeed, that's what we see happen. So the army went out into the field against Israel in verse 6, and the battle was fought in the forests of Ephraim. Now, I have no idea how forested Ephraim was. Ephraim was a mountainous place, as I understand it. And we know that there are mountainous areas that are very covered with woods, and we know there are mountainous places that were not. But since this is referring to the forest of Ephraim, it's a pretty good assumption that it was fairly forested. The men of Israel were defeated there by the servants of David, and the loss there was great on that day, 20,000 men. The battle spread over the face of all the country, and the forest devoured more people that day than the sword. So the forest itself presented an obstacle to the forces against David, and this great slaughter was not simply the result of the sword, but in fact the inability of the Israelites to fight in this forest. And in verse 9 we see Absalom happened to meet the servants of David. And I've always envisioned this as Absalom fleeing. It doesn't say that here. It says Absalom was riding on his mule, and the mule went under the thick branches of a great oak, and his head was caught fast in the oak, and he was suspended between heaven and earth. So we know that he had great long hair, and it's always been said that it was his hair that tangled in the woods of the great oak that caught him up. So he wasn't caught by his neck, he was caught by his hair, and he was dangling from the branches of this great oak by his hair. Now it doesn't again say that here, but I have a tendency to believe that is exactly what happened, because he was still alive. And if he'd been caught by his neck, it would have been more like him being hanged by his neck. And he was suspended there between heaven and earth, while the mule that was under him went on. In verse 10, a certain man saw it and told Joab, "Behold, I saw Absalom hanging on an oak." And Joab responds, "What? You saw him? Why didn't you strike him down there to the ground? I would have been glad to give you 10 pieces of silver and a belt." So apparently this was a great reward. But the man said to Joab, "Even if I felt in my hand the weight of 1,000 pieces of silver, I would not reach out my hand against the king's son. For in our hearing the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai, for my sake protect the young man Absalom. On the other hand, if I had dealt treacherously against his life, and there is nothing hidden from the king, then you yourself would have stood aloof." So he knew well what would have happened had he taken the opportunity to do this thing himself. Joab said, "I will not waste time like this with you." And he took 3 javelins in his hand and thrust them into the heart of Absalom while he was still alive in the oak. And 10 young men, Joab's armor-bearers, surrounded Absalom and struck him and killed him. So this passage tells me a lot about different things that I've often wondered about. First, apparently 1 javelin is not enough to kill a man unless he's very, very unfortunate. And here Absalom is hanging in a tree, and Joab takes 3 javelins, which must have been much smaller than I have always thought of a javelin as being, and he throws them, and he thrusts them. He doesn't throw them. He thrusts them with his own hand directly into the heart of Absalom, And apparently that was not even yet enough to kill Absalom. And then these 10 young men, Joab's armor bearers, surrounded Absalom and struck him and killed him. So now I'm of a mind to believe that an armor bearer was not simply one who carried weapons for a person, but was more of a personal bodyguard that was set around a man to protect him, as well as offer weapons to him when he needed them. So this is a different function for an armor bearer than I would have been aware of otherwise. In verse 16, Joab blew the trumpet, and the troops came back from pursuing Israel, for Joab restrained them. So he brought an end to the conflict, and they took Absalom and threw him into a great pit in the forest, and raised over him a very great heap of stones. And all Israel fled, everyone to his own home. And again, I think there's a distinction being made here between Israel and those who had supported David. And he's saying here that all those who had supported Absalom fled to their homes. Now, Absalom in his lifetime had taken and set up for himself the pillar that is in the king's valley, for he said, I have no son to keep my name in remembrance. But we know from a previous passage that he did indeed have several sons. So perhaps he did this prior to having these sons that are mentioned in the other passage. But at any rate, he did have a monument in the king's valley that he'd set up for himself. And it is still called Absalom's monument to the date of the writing of this passage. To this day, that's an interesting way that they had of recounting things. It tells you the nature of the way this passage was written. It was not written to be read the way we're reading it. It was written to be read by someone much closer to the events that it had transpired. So it was more of a log or a summary of a log, perhaps, or maybe it's more of a direct quote from the actual annals of the kings that are referred to in other passages. This is a much more detailed story than we get in other places. There are interesting details that are presented here that are not necessarily in support of the overall story. They're just kind of recounted here, and that kind of tells me that perhaps this is something that has been taken from another area and put here. But whatever the case may be, it's much, much later than the events transpired, but closer to the events than certainly our time. Because even at the time that this was written, this monument still stood. Going on in verse 19, Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said, let me run and carry the news to the king. So Ahimaaz must not have been schooled in how David received bad news, because it doesn't take much review of his history to know that you don't want to be the person who brings David bad news. But David knew Ahimaaz. He knew who he was because he was Zadok's son. Joab knew this as well, and he didn't want him killed. So he advised him, you're not to carry news today. You may carry the news some other day. You are going to carry no news because the king's son is dead. And then he turns to the Cushite, and I would assume the Cushite was, because he's not identified by name, he must have been a slave or someone of very minor importance to Joab. And he says to the Cushite, go and tell the king. Then Ahimaaz again pursues Joab and says, please let me go. I want to go alongside the Cushite, indicating, I believe, that he would have let the Cushite bring the news, but he wanted to be there to see the king when he received the news, because he perceived it as good news. Joab said to him, why will you run, my son, seeing that you will have no reward for the news? Well, I believe Joab knew well that the danger was that he would have more than no reward. He might lose his life. Ahimaaz responds in verse 23, come what may, I will run. So he said to him, so Joab responds to him, run. And Ahimaaz ran by the way of the plain and outran the Cushite. So he intended to get there before the Cushite and tell David the news, which is indeed what happens. There's the story here of the watchman looking and seeing the man run, then seeing the second man far behind, and realizing that the first man ran like Ahimaaz, identified who he was by the way that he ran. Each individual carries themselves in such a unique way that they can often be easily identified simply by the way they move. My son once told me that he saw his shadow one day as he was walking, and it startled him because he thought that it was me, and he saw the way he moved was similar to the way that I moved, and he perceived that the shadow was my shadow. And that's interesting that Ahimaaz carried himself in such an unusual way that he could be identified so easily. But again, the lookouts were trained for this purpose as well. The king said, "He is a good man and comes with good news." Then Ahimaaz cried out to the king in verse 28, "All is well." And he bowed before the king with his face to the earth and said, "Blessed be the Lord your God, who has delivered up the men who raised their hand against my lord the king." And the king said, "Is it well with the young man Absalom?" Ahimaaz answered, "When Joab sent the king's servant, your servant, I saw a great commotion, but I do not know what it was." And I don't think that was truthful, but it was probably wise. And the king said, "Turn aside and stand here." So he turned aside and stood still. And behold, the Cushite came. And the Cushite said, "Good news for my lord the king, for the Lord has delivered you this day from the hand of all who rose up against you." The king said to the Cushite, "Is it well with the young man Absalom?" And the Cushite answered, "May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up against you for evil be like the young man." And the king was deeply moved, and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, he said, "O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son." It's very moving, it's very touching, it's very sad. It's a very different reaction that David had to the death of Absalom than he had to the death of that first child with Bathsheba. He knew Absalom in a way that he did not know that first child of Bathsheba, so certainly while they are different, it's understandable. We're going to read more about this reaction next week in chapter 19, but it is such a sad, sad thing, such a sad end. These terrible things that came upon David, the consequences they had in his family, to men who had not committed the same sin as David, who committed our own set of sins, but who did these things as part of the judgment that God had made against David for his own sin against God with Bathsheba. Certainly a dire warning about what sin can do to us. I hope you found a word of encouragement in this lesson today. Certainly it's not over. We have several more chapters before this passage is truly done with, and it is not yet as over as I would like it to be, because it is still terrible. Emma Richardson passed. I'm happy that she's gone to be with the Lord. I'm happy that she's gone on to her reward. My prayers go out to her family at her loss. I got to see her shortly before she went into the hospital the last time. Spent a few moments with her. Her time was spent reminiscing about her life with her husband and her sons, her family. She was a wonderful woman who did great things for me, and I will appreciate her kindness toward me in my hour of need. I look forward to the day when we can see each other again. We will be meeting today at 10 a.m., so please join us if you can. Hope to see you there. If you're sick in any way, please don't come to the auditorium, but instead stay home and enjoy the streaming service. God bless. Have a great week.
Desire and sing.